Well, welcome everyone to this presentation on ministry burnout and how to deal with it. The first thing I like to start off with is this idea that we need to be healthy as individual ministers of various types, mostly youth ministers here tonight. But if we're not healthy and if we're not well balanced in our own lives in all areas, it's going to be hard to be effective as ministers and disciple makers to others. One misconception that people often have is that we have these different domains of who we are, our biological nature, psychological, social, spiritual, environmental, and all this. And that's true. We do have those different domains, but they're not neatly compartmentalized in our lives where, our social life doesn't affect our psychological life and our biological doesn't affect our spiritual life. Really, the truth is that all of these are intimately linked and therefore greatly affect the others. And I think it suffices to say that if any of them are significantly out of balance, all are going to be affected. Now, the key to being a good spiritual or ministry leader, and that goes from the Pope down to us youth ministers, is to, of course, fundamentally have a very deep personal relationship with God and to be reasonably healthy in all the different dimensions of our life that I just mentioned a moment ago. And to achieve this, it's very important to reflect on your situation and your needs regularly and address them. So, burnout. We're talking about burnout tonight. And this is a very common problem when we do not care for ourselves. As I said before, we've got to care for ourselves to be good for others. But when we don't do that, we can reach this place of burnout. And what burnout is it's actually a diagnosable condition now. A lot of people don't know that only a few years ago, the World Health Organization actually officially recognized burnout as a diagnosable condition. I would not say it's a mental illness, but it is certainly a psychological condition which has a lot of different characteristics and a lot of factors that play into it. And so now we can actually, you can go online and read about this and sort of self-diagnose, and professionals can even diagnose this. And I'm going to send you, as a quick side note, I'm going to send you an article entitled 12 Reasons for Ministry Burnout. And this article I'll send you is going to have some overlap with what I speak about here tonight, but some of what I'll say will be different. And there's also some different things in that article. So that's going to be a very valuable tool that I think you can keep and revisit from time to time. You can also revisit these notes, but that article I actually revisit on a regular basis, probably every 6 months or so, just to kind of keep myself in check and make sure that I'm not letting anything creep in. And I have found that to be very helpful. And I've also shared it with many individuals who have told me that they've been experiencing things related to burnout. So next, I want to touch on some tips for self-care if you are experiencing burnout, or if you would like to avoid burnout. Some of these will go in either direction. But the first tip that I like to mention is, as I said before, you're no good in ministry if you're not healthy. You're no good to others. So the analogy that is wonderful to use in this situation is that analogy of like being on a plane and the plane's about to take off and the stewardess is telling you, if suddenly we lose a whole bunch of altitude, or if we start to go down or something goes wrong with the plane, from above, there's going to be this oxygen mask that drops down. And they say, don't help your neighbor before you put your own mask on. Put your mask on first so that you can breathe, and then you'll be able to help your neighbor. Why? Because if you don't put your mask on first, you're going to lose all your air quickly while you're helping someone else, and you're going to pass out. You may not even finish helping them. So the same is true in ministry. We've got to put our mask on first. So the first thing that we need to do if we happen to be experiencing some symptoms of burnout is don't make any big decisions. In the spiritual life, if we are experiencing a place of desolation, not consolation, spiritual directors will say never make any decisions in a place of desolation. The same is true in burnout. When we try to make decisions in these places, usually we make rash decisions. And that would be something like quitting all of the sudden, because we just want to alleviate the negative feelings or the stress that we're feeling. So we just say, I'm done, I can't do it. Well, this is not good, because oftentimes our feelings later are feelings of regret. We wish we hadn't made that decision. So first thing, don't make a decision when you're feeling like you're burned out or stressed or anxious or fearful or whatever. The next step would be to self-diagnose, or if you feel the need, maybe seek a counselor to help you discern, are you experiencing burnout? Burnout is not generally considered a potentially dangerous condition, so it's not always necessary to start by seeking a professional like you would if you were experiencing a true mental illness like depression, anxiety, or a personality disorder. It's okay to get on Google and research what are the symptoms of burnout and see, am I experiencing a number of those? Am I experiencing maybe more than half of them? If you are, then the idea would be, okay, proceed to the next tips I'm going to give you. If you're not sure, perhaps it is time then to seek a professional who can help you with the nuances of whether or not what you're feeling correlates to or corresponds to the symptoms that you will find are identified by medical and mental health professionals as symptoms of burnout. So, use your judgment. Do you need a professional? I think start off by saying, well, let's see what I can figure out on my own. And then from there, move on to needing help if you need, or seeking help if you need. The next thing I suggest is make a list or identify of the contributing factors that you feel are present to your burnout. So, look at all the different domains of biological, psychological, social, spiritual, environmental, etc. Biological, maybe, are you eating well? Are you sleeping? Are you getting exercise? Are you getting downtime and free time? Downtime as a biological need is one I think a lot of people overlook. So that's just one I like to point out. Downtime is not necessarily just sleep. Sometimes it's recreation, it's fun, it's doing things that are good for your body apart from exercise. Psychological elements would be, are you struggling with any internal issues mentally, like depression, anxiety, fear, uncertainty, or anger, sadness, unforgiveness? I'd like to point out that fear and uncertainty are ones that are often overlooked, especially by people in our field. And we'll touch on some of those in a later few points that we'll go over. Social issues could be, do you have healthy personal or work or ministry relationships? Or do you have a community of support or friendships within ministry of people that can support you, who understand what you're going through? Spiritually, how is your prayer life? Are you struggling with your faith? How is your relationship with God? Anything to do with spirituality needs to be assessed when you're making this list of factors. The next, or the last domain, would be environmental. And this would be, generally your work and your ministry environment. Is it a healthy environment? Are you able to use your gifts in your ministry? Are you being appreciated? Are you being supported? There's lots of different factors that can play into this. But your environment is something that is a little outside of your control, but it certainly can have a big impact on you. The next step that I often recommend, and sometimes this one can actually come before making a list because it can actually help you make the list, but sometimes it comes after. You ask yourself, you do this exercise that I've gleaned from time in counseling settings. I have a degree in social work, so I learned some of this from those classes. But this exercise is one that is used by counselors, and you simply take time to ask yourself this question: if I could wake up tomorrow and everything would be better, what exactly would be different? I'm going to ask you again. If I could wake up tomorrow and everything would be better, what exactly would be different? Now, this exercise is aims at helping us identify the big things that we need to change, the biggest factors that might bubble up in our minds when we ask this question. So maybe something big would be, I'm not feeling appreciated at work or in my ministry, or I just simply do not have the time to get everything I'm being expected to do done. Maybe I'm not being given the resources. Maybe I don't have a budget, and that's just been really weighing on me. Whatever it is, these are going to be probably the biggest things that you need to work on to alleviate some of the burnout. Again, this exercise may need to come before making a list, and it may need to be done with help from a mentor or somebody you can talk through these things with. The next thing I recommend people do is assess your relationship with God. We kind of touched on this already as the spiritual domain, but this really deserves a lot of attention. Again, are you praying every day? Are you reading scripture? Do you receive the sacraments on a regular basis, especially Eucharist and confession? I tell a story about this. We are not immune to deep spiritual struggles. I had a friend years ago who had a good friend who was a Protestant minister, and he said his friend confided in him one time and said, you would be shocked at how many atheists there are in ministry, especially or even in pastor roles. And this is a Protestant minister, so I don't know how this translates to our Catholic Church, but he said he personally knows several Protestant pastors who are atheists. Now that's hard to believe, but my friend asked him, like, how can this be? And he said, I asked them, and they said, well, I lost my faith years ago with just struggles and trials and seeing tremendous suffering. And he said, well, why do you stay in ministry then? Why do you stay a pastor? And they said, well, because I went to seminary for this. This is all I'm trained to do. I'm good at it. I know how to preach. I'm being well paid and as a pastor. And so, yeah, I'm just kind of stuck. So I just keep doing it because I don't know what else to do. Again, I don't know how this translates to our Catholic Church, but I would imagine this exists, or, maybe not quite to that extreme with most people, but certainly all of us, none of us are immune to great spiritual struggles. And so, again, this is really foundational when it comes to ministry. Sure, we need to be biologically and psychologically healthy. We need healthy relationships, etc. But our spiritual life is really key when it comes to ministry. So we need to take time to assess that. In order to do that, sometimes we need to get ourselves a spiritual director or a ministry mentor or a friend that can help us. This should generally not be your pastor or your supervisor, unless it's a very special relationship that can exist. I have had those relationships with my pastors before, or even my supervisors, but usually it needs to be someone outside the situation, someone outside of ourselves, who can help us see things that we can't see alone. Usually they can come at things with a very rational and objective point of view that we just can't have when we're emotionally in it. Maybe you need to show them your list of factors you came up with, or maybe they need to help you put together this list of factors because you've reached a place where you just can't do this on your own. So again, I really encourage everyone in ministry, especially if you're really struggling, to seek a spiritual director or mentor, or at least somebody who you would say would be a sort of spiritual friend who can accompany you through this challenge. Last, I would encourage all of you to have a local community, even if it's just 2 or 3 friends in ministry who are a community of ministers, people who understand the struggle. Maybe they're youth ministers, maybe they have other roles like DREs and RCIA coordinators or people in other kinds of ministry, but people who understand ministry so that you can talk with them, bounce things off of them, get support from them. That's what church is. We're not meant to go at this alone. And ministry, especially youth ministry, is really one of the most difficult jobs. So I have had this in previous seasons of my life, and I have found it to be very, very fruitful. It's not something you necessarily constantly have to have, but definitely throughout different seasons of ministry, it's very valuable to have this community in your life. I try to provide some of that through these kinds of meetings, but having someone local that you can actually meet in person with is really a step in the right direction. It's really valuable. It gives you a little more than we can do in these meetings. Next, I want to touch on two kinds of pressure that are going to contribute to burnout and stress. And it's very helpful to understand these two different kinds because some you have more control over than others. Some you've got to communicate about to others. Some you need to do some introspection about. So those, as you see on your screen, are outside pressure and inside pressure. Outside pressure would be things like expectations from a boss or a supervisor, expectations from the parish, from parents that you serve, from the youth themselves, deadlines we need to meet, commitments we've made, etc. Inside pressures would be things like personal expectations you have on yourself, fears, doubts, worries, low self-esteem, feelings of inadequacy or self-criticism. Now, I want to start with dealing with pressures from the outside. The key to managing pressure from the outside is first, and I should say the keys, we're going to go over several things. First, knowing what's expected of you. If you don't know what's expected of you, you need to ask for a job description or a ministry description. What is it your supervisor, your pastor, whoever it is it really expecting from you? Together, put together a list of 1, 3, and 5-year goals so that you can have some reasonable things to look forward to in the future and know what it is you're working toward. Have an activity schedule for the year so that you know how the year is going to be laid out. Ask what results are expected of the goals that you all are setting. And finally, talk about how those results are going to be measured. And are they going to be measured in a way where if you don't achieve them, that's a problem, or that we simply need to revisit and adjust our strategies? Next, I would say we need to set boundaries. A lot of people people ask a lot of people who are in ministry, a lot of ministry leaders. I dare say ministry jobs are some of the hardest jobs out there. And people ask so much of us, but we can't make people show up. We can't make people do anything we want them to do. Our jobs are all about sort of selling Jesus to people, convincing people of doing the things that we feel will be good for them. And ultimately, when we feel like people are expecting a lot of us and they're starting to cross our boundaries, we've got to communicate what we can and cannot do. We've especially got to learn that word no. You do not automatically have to do everything that is asked of you. And by not saying no when you really should, you could be creating an unhealthy and an unfair environment that the next person who will fill your role will have to live up to. And that's not fair to them. That's creating a very unrealistic environment, and your pastor or whoever it may be may expect much more out of that next person than they really should. And they shouldn't be expecting too much out of you either. Very often our inability to say no comes from fears of like being fired or disciplined or not being liked, or feelings of guilt that maybe someone else will be disciplined or whatever is being asked won't get done. Sometimes things not happening is is a necessary catalyst for change, though. And so we do have to be able to communicate to whoever it is we're dealing with and say, listen, I understand that that's what you want, but I am not able to achieve that. I have enough on my plate already, or I can achieve that, but here's what's going to have to change. I'm going to have to drop some of these other things. Or perhaps it's a conversation where you say, you know, I just don't feel like that's a realistic expectation. I like to pick on Clara and say, you know, if Clara, my assistant here, were here and I came in and said, listen, Clara, I'm going to need those reports to be done by tonight at 8 o'clock. Well, she's going to say, well, Mark, I typically go home at 4:30. I may be able to stay till 5, but I'm sorry, I don't have enough time between now and 5 to get those reports done for you because it's already 2 o'clock. I can get them to you by tomorrow at noon, but that's going to be what I'm going to have to do. She's got to be able to communicate to me when she can and can't do something. Certainly, there are other types of expectations I could try to put on her, like, Clara, I'm going to need you to, after work today, go get my dry cleaning and pick up some groceries. And tomorrow morning, I'm going to need you to get on some tennis shoes and go up on the roof of the chancery and start removing that roof. And we're going to put a new roof on soon. Those would be things that Clara would really need to be able to say to me, well, no, sir, that's not going to happen. I'm not your wife, and I'm not going to pick up your dry cleaning or get you food or put a roof on the chancery. I'm pretty sure the insurance company wouldn't like that one. We do have to be able to be bold and tell our supervisors, the people we work with, our communities we serve, when an expectation is just unrealistic, and be bold about it and say, look, that's just unrealistic. I'm not going to be doing that for you. There are times when we need to say that. Next, we need to know when, within boundary setting, we need to know when we need to cut things out of our schedule. And sometimes that can be things that we've already committed to. That can be a very hard conversation to have, but I've had to do it myself, where I've said, look, I'm very sorry that I said I was going to do this, but I got in over my head, and I'm going to have to tell you I can't do this at this point. Boy, that's an unpleasant conversation to have, but sometimes it needs to be had. We've got to be able to communicate to people when we've just taken on too much, and not kill ourselves in the process of trying to do everything when we really need to cut something out. We also need to communicate when things aren't helpful. People don't know what they don't know. So if you have somebody in your life, or whomever, a group of people who are putting an expectation on you, or whatever it may be that is just not healthy or not good, you need to be able to communicate to them about this. And usually when you say, look, this expectation that you are asking of me is really unrealistic, and it's making me stressed out. It's just not working for me. Usually when we do that, people are reasonable, and they're going to be able to accept that and say, okay, well, how can we work with this? This is actually biblical. Jesus himself told us that we need to do this. In Matthew chapter 18, he said, if your brother sins against you, go and tell him his fault between you and him alone. This doesn't just have to be a sin. He's talking about sin here, but you can apply this to anything. We have a right and an obligation to go communicate to people when there's a problem. So, you know, sometimes it takes the virtue of fortitude. We may have to pray for an increase in that, but we've got to be able to go and set boundaries with people and communicate when things aren't helpful. One just quick story, I have a friend who I still communicate with regularly, and I would say I mentor him. He works in another diocese, and he came to me very recently, and he said, my supervisor is asking me for explanations about what I'm spending on my company credit card every month. And Mark, I don't know what to do, because, you know, I'm not over budget in any area, and especially not over in my entire budget. And so sometimes if I go a little over, I can just adjust in other places. But my budget was approved last summer, and I'm having to explain this every month, and it's really stressing me out. I'm like afraid to spend another dollar because he's going to question it. And so I told him, look, you need to go to him and say, help me understand what it means when my budget is approved. Does that mean that I am free to spend it the way that I was approved to spend it, and the way I see fit if I need to make some adjustments? Because I'm not over budget in any way, and yet you're asking for explanations each month that I have to submit my credit card statement. And I got to tell you, this is really stressing me out. It's making me uncomfortable. I told him, you need to go and do that with your supervisor. We all have these times where this happens, but all of this falls under setting boundaries with people and communicating what is not helping and what we need in order to succeed. So again, you have to pray for some fortitude in these situations, but we have to be able to do this as professionals. Next, I want to touch on dealing with pressures from within. There are all kinds of different pressures that we put on ourselves, but the first thing I like to tell people is the weight of the church does not rest on your shoulders. Neither does the weight of your parish, neither does the weight of even your own youth program. Why? Because you can't control other people. You can't make people do anything. All you can control is yourself. And we're going to touch on that a little bit in a few minutes, but just unburden yourself and understand that all of this is not on you. Your choices, your abilities are on you, and you can freely use those, but everything else, or there's so many other things that are not on you. So try to unburden yourself. The next one is self-criticism. This is a very, very common inside pressure that we deal with. We're all our own biggest critics, and we really just need to treat ourselves as we would want to expect ourselves to treat others, and as we would expect others to treat us. It's a very fair exchange there, a very fair expectation to put on ourselves. We've got to stop being so self-critical. I'm going to just tell you the simplest way to deal with that is just stop it. Just stop it. Stop doing that. Stop being self-critical. I say that jokingly. There is a video that I'm going to encourage you, write this down real quick. You may have heard of the great comedian Bob Newhart. He's probably was biggest in the 70s and the 80s. He had TV shows. Go Google Bob, or actually put into YouTube, Bob Newhart, Stop It. And you'll get just I think it's a 5-minute little clip of him from one of his shows where he's a counselor, and you're going to love it. It's hilarious. I get a laugh every time I watch this. He basically sums up most of what counseling ends up amounting to. And I really don't mean that in a derogatory way, but ultimately, you know, a lot of things we just really need to stop doing. Sometimes we got to figure out how and why and all that, but you'll get the point when you watch it. So go and watch that, and just stop being so self-critical. Next, we compare ourselves to others. You may have heard the phrase, comparison is the thief of joy. We do not need to look at other youth ministers and other ministry leaders and say, oh, their youth program is so much bigger than mine, or they're so much better at their advertising, or they just look so much better in a V-neck than I do. We don't need to look at others and allow their successes to be our criticism or our failure. Their successes are things we can learn from. And so we can look at them and say, wow, that's great. I can learn from them. And there's things about ourselves others can learn from. So again, no need to compare ourselves. This is another one where I would just simply say, stop that. Just stop it. Don't do that. If only it was that easy, right? Again, comparison is the thief of joy. If you live in a place of comparison all the time, you will never be happy with anything you do. Next, internal pressure would be stress of all different kinds. We need to not hide our stresses. We need to talk to people about them. This is where, if we really are having a lot of stress, it's good to talk this stuff out with maybe a friend, maybe a mentor, maybe a professional. When we bottle stress up, ultimately, it is an interior pressure that if we don't alleviate in some healthy way, it's going to alleviate itself by probably, unfortunately, some kind of outburst or a rash decision. And if we jump way back, remember, we don't want to be making decisions in a place of stress, burnout, anxiety, etc. Next would be excessive worrying and trying to control too much. I put these together because they really are sort of mirrored in how they work. This visual illustration here, I think, is very helpful to kind of understand what it is that we do and how we can look at these two issues that probably most people in ministry deal with. So on the left, you'll see all that we worry will go wrong is in this big blue circle. We often worry about everything, all the different factors that can go wrong. And then in this smaller peach circle is what realistically could go wrong, which is a lot less stuff. And then in this small circle, this represents what actually does go wrong. So if you think back to maybe the last time you were really stressed over something, think about all the different things you worried about. You probably worried very excessively. That would be represented by this blue circle. A lot of things that you worried about that really weren't realistic. Then you can think about, well, in that situation, what really should I have been concerned about? Not necessarily worry. We really don't need to worry, but you can be concerned about things. What realistically could have gone wrong? And then think about, okay, in that situation, in that event or whatever I was planning, what did go wrong? It was probably pretty minimal. Every once in a while, something big does go wrong, but it's pretty rare. And usually what does go wrong, and there's always something, is pretty minimal. So if we do this exercise by reflecting on the past, reflect on something that we've done in the past that we have worried about especially, and we think, okay, I worried so much, there wasn't that much realistically that even could have gone wrong, and not much did go wrong. So now that I'm looking forward at this next big event or this next thing I'm planning or whatever it is, let me use this place of reason to think about this situation. Let me just think about what is realistically possible. And I'm going to plan in advance how to deal with that, what my backup plan will be, so that what actually does go wrong will be very minimal. And of course, could a tornado fly in at any time and wipe everything out? Yes, that is theoretically possible, but I would not categorize that as something that is realistic. That would go into the big blue circle that we really don't need to worry about. Similarly, the same kind of exercise can, or same kind of, I would say, illustration here can be used to quantify all that we try to control. And gosh, most of us in ministry are control freaks. We try to control just about everything. But what we're actually expected to control, even if it's sometimes unrealistic by pastors or our supervisors or the community or whatever, even what that stuff is much smaller. It's way smaller than what we actually try to control. And then what we are actually able to control is very, very small. As I said before, I mean, you can control your actions. You can control whether you prepare for things or not. You can control your attitude about things, but you can't control anything about what other people choose to do. And that's most of your life. Most of your life is all that goes on around you. It's not all that you do. You can control how you interact with what goes on, but there's so much in your life that you didn't choose. You didn't choose who your family was, your friends. Maybe you didn't even choose where you live. I mean, it just chose you in some ways. So the point is, we really need to try to let go of this illusion of control, because we don't have control over everything. And by trying to control things that we literally can't is going to cause us a lot of stress, and it can lead to burnout, of course. Lastly, in this, in inside pressures, we need to have an understanding of what it is to work too hard. We are called to die to ourselves so that Christ can live in us, yes. And many of us serve because we die to ourselves and we're very giving. But dying to ourselves is not the same thing as killing ourselves by working ourselves to death, okay? Dying to yourself in your will and allowing Christ to enter is very different than working yourself to death. So we really need to work into our lives a reasonable amount of rest. We do not live to work. We work so that we can live. This is a bit of an adaptation of the quote that you see on the screen there by Pope St. John Paul the Great, but I really believe he was prophetic when he said this, and our culture needs this. Ask yourself, am I a workaholic or a ministryaholic? If I ask myself that question, the answer is I at least have a tendency in that direction. I really do. I could easily go into that. But luckily I'm aware of that. And so I use the cardinal virtue of temperance, and I temper that as much as I can. Am I perfect? No, I do overdo it sometimes. I like to do what I do here. I love my job. And they say, of course, if you love your job, you'll never work a day in your life. I don't know if that's true in ministry, because there are some bad days in ministry. I'm not going to lie. There are days where I'm like, what have I gotten myself into? And I'll explain later where that comes from on one of the last slides here. But yeah, ministry can be hard, but I also like to work at home. I love projects. I like building things. I like working on my house, but I've got to temper that and give myself time to be with my family, to have rest. And so we all need to really make sure that we are not overworking. And so many of us in ministry need to look at, are we taking a full 2 days off every week? During those days off, are we giving ourselves time to really be away and not answer phone calls and texts and things like that? So again, there is such thing as working too hard. And I know I said lastly on that slide, but actually this one is the last one in this section. We have often a mistaken view of what success means, and we really need to understand what success in ministry is and how to measure it. Measuring success in ministry can mean maybe if a program was successful, it could be like, did we get numbers? Did people show up? Did we have conversions? We can certainly measure programs and strategies with quantifiable things like that. But we got to be very careful when it comes to measuring success of ourselves or our own success in ministry by those other things, because we are not those other things. Those are not us. We are people, and those strategies that we employ or those programs are not us. And so if they succeed or not, that is not necessarily a reflection on ourselves. So we need to be able to separate those two things and understand that if some strategy or program, quote unquote, fails, that does not have to be a reflection on who we are and cause us all kinds of burnout and stress. Ultimately, our success, our personal success, as I've probably said to you many times in other meetings, is measured by our faithfulness to God and what He is asking of us. God is asking you to be faithful. He's not asking you to be successful. Again, you don't have full control over that anyway. We all get so caught up in these other ways of being successful, of trying to get numbers, of measuring the way the world or a business might measure, but you don't always get what you expect, and it may not be what God is even asking of you. Sometimes all God is asking of us is to be a prophet or to give people a chance, even if He knows that they are not going to take it. So there are many prophets in the Bible who God sent, and He knew in advance, He's all-knowing, that they were going to be rejected. Did that prophet fail at what they did? Of course not. They succeeded in doing God's will and doing what He asked of them. It's the people who rejected them who failed. And so sometimes when we go to a parish and we do our best and things just don't work out the way we want, or we do a program, it doesn't work out, you know, in the end, God can say, look, you did what I asked you to do there, and the people rejected it. And I'm going to be able to point that out to them when they say, well, Lord, why didn't you do something for my child? And you can say, well, I sent those people who are here on this Zoom call tonight to you, and they offered you themselves, and you didn't take it. They had their hand out and you didn't take the hand. So again, being faithful to God is what God is calling us to do. And lastly, when it comes to success, if you really want to look at what is going to help you to get those results that you're looking for, your success is going to come through your relationships, not your programs. So while I don't want you to just measure yourself by relationships, that is your bread and butter when it comes to getting results. People are not evangelized through programs. Chances are you're not going to see a lot of fruit from your labor through relationships in a short span of time. It often comes through many months and many years down the road when their youth and their families recognize in themselves, or maybe you see from a distance the impact you've made. Sometimes it's immediate. Sometimes it's in the short run and you can see it. But I like to use the example of building a cathedral. Many, many people build these beautiful churches, these great cathedrals over many decades and centuries, especially the old ones, and they didn't see them completed. A good example is the new cathedral basilica over in St. Louis, which took 76 years to build. Well, you know, there are people who started that thing and didn't see it finished. Sometimes that's the way ministry is. We plant seeds, we nourish those seeds, the Spirit provides the rain and other nourishment, and we don't see them fully grow or blossom. But if you're faithful to God and you work on that relationship over time, it's going to grow. There are going to be many seeds that do flower and bloom, maybe not all of them, but sometimes you'll get those few that you get to see in the short run where you really did get to make an impact. But again, I can't stress enough that our relationships are absolutely fundamental and our bread and butter when it comes to ministry. Those are where we need to be focusing, not our programs and our events and our et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, whatever other things we have. I'm not saying don't do those things, but those things should be a means to building those long-lasting relationships. And if they're not, I'm just telling you now, they're not going to work. This is the way the gospel has always been spread, and it's the way we need to kind of rediscover it being spread today. 2 more slides. Second to last one is here. The last important reality I really want to encourage you to understand is we've got to not ignore the spiritual battle that is not just going on around us, but is at the heart of what we are doing. One of my favorite passages in scripture is Sirach chapter 2, verse 1. When you strive to serve the Lord, prepare for an ordeal. As I told you earlier, I sometimes have my days where I'm like, what have I gotten myself into, Lord? Why does everything have to be a battle? Well, it's because that's the nature of what we're doing. Everything we're doing is actually a battle. What do I mean? What kind of battle is this? Well, for that, we've got to go to Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 through 19. And as I say this, this passage to you, I'm going to do it from memory. I like to do this for practice because this is one of my favorite passages. But I want you to look at this picture as I quote this scripture passage to you. Just look around at it and listen to the words of Jesus as I do this. So as they were entering the district of Caesarea Philippi, Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, "Who do people say that the Son of Man is?" And his disciples replied, "Some say John the Baptist, others Elijah or one of the prophets." And Jesus said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter spoke up and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." And Jesus said to them, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood has not revealed this to you, but my Father who's in heaven. And I say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. I give to you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven." And then he strictly told them not to tell anyone he was the Christ. Now, what is the connection here? Well, you're looking at a picture of a very major, well-known place in none other than the district of Caesarea Philippi. The apostles would have known the district of Caesarea Philippi. They knew their surroundings, just like we today know all the towns around us and everything, and we know monuments and common places people go to around us. Well, they would have known this place, and chances are, very likely, Jesus was walking by this very place with his apostles, and it makes perfect sense that he was, because what this place is a place where on top of that rock, there was a temple to what is known as Jupiter, the king god in the Roman religion. It was up on top of that cliff, and down where you see this massive cave, there was a temple covering that cave. And on the right of the cave, you see a little grotto, and that was a grotto to a god known as Pan. Now that god Pan is where that the word Pan is where we get the word pandemonium, and pandemonium means chaos, and it has a negative connotation, especially the further back you go. And God of Pan was really kind of known as an evil figure. And this big cave that you see here was actually known as the gates of Hades, or the gates of hell, if you kind of transliterate that into modern English. So just think about this. Very likely, Jesus saying these words was probably saying them as the apostles were walking by and had a good view of this visual structure here. And of course, we don't see today the temples that were there, but you can Google this and you'll see kind of renditions of what it may have looked like. So just imagine Jesus is saying, "You're Peter, you are rock, and on this rock I will build my church." So you're seeing this big church, this big temple on top of this rock. And it's the temple to a king God, but Jesus is the new king, and he is God. And he's going to build this temple on top of a new rock, Peter. and the gates of hell will not prevail against it. Well, here's this massive cave where this temple is built over the gates of hell, and they believed that this temple actually held back those gates, that underworld. Now, when he said the gates of hell will not prevail against it, what does he mean? Well, when in ancient times, when you were in battle, when cultures would go to battle with each other, usually it would happen by chance, or well, I should say as a surprise, and a culture, a group, a nation would go against another nation by surprise, because that's when you have the element of surprise, that's your best chance at getting the upper hand. And so they would storm the gates of their city. They would try to sack their city. And cities usually were surrounded by a big wall. And in the Holy Land, you can see there's a giant wall around Jerusalem. They would have gates, maybe in one or in several places or in those walls, and you would naturally have to storm those gates. You would have to attack those gates and get through them in order to get into the city and ransack the city, pillage and kill people and all this kind of thing. So in battle, for the gates to prevail meant that they did not fall when the army attacked them. So how does this relate to what Jesus said? Well, what Jesus said is that the gates of hell will not prevail against the church. Well, that means that hell, the devil, is really not attacking us. We are attacking him. The church is attacking him. When Christ came, he took over the world, which was in death because there was no sanctifying grace yet. Christ brought that back. And so he took over the world and really made a major impact of destruction on Satan's kingdom. And now all that's left are the gates of hell, where people, still can go, but we are constantly, through our efforts of evangelization and helping people understand the importance of baptism and receiving sanctifying grace, we are storming those gates, what is left over of Satan's stronghold, so to speak, and we are going to demolish those, because Christ promised the gates of hell are not going to prevail. You're going to get through them. We are going to get through them. We're going to storm hell, and we are going to obliterate everything that's left on this earth of what Satan has done for a long time. And all that's left is going to be that eternal place where people do have the freedom to choose to go. But right now we're trying to rescue people out of that place of darkness and of sin. And the thing is, Satan doesn't like that. He really doesn't like that. And that's why when you strive to serve the Lord, you should prepare for an ordeal, because he's going to do everything he can to get in the way of what you are doing. Because through our ministries, we are literally impacting the eternal salvation of young people, their families, of the community, etc. And Satan doesn't want that. So he's going to try to stand in your way. The demons are going to try to stand in your way. Everything is going to be a battle. Everything's going to be hard. And we've just got to get used to that. But we've got to have peace in knowing that it is we who are storming his gates. We are attacking him. We have the upper hand. We have the power of God on our side. We have the sacraments. We have sanctifying grace. We do not need to fear. He fears us. He flees when we invoke the name of Jesus and the name of the Blessed Mother and use holy water and proclaim the truth of the gospel and so many other things. He flees from that because he has no power in the face of Jesus Christ. But when we forget this, when we don't employ our ability to be confident and powerful in our ministries, that's when he starts to creep out of those gates and he comes out into our territory and messes with us. All we've got to do is recognize the gifts and the tools and the armor that God has given us and the weapons we have: prayer, the sacraments, the gospel, the name of Jesus, et cetera, the authority we have been given through baptism and confirmation and the Eucharist, the ability to cleanse ourselves through the sacrament of reconciliation. I could go on and on. But if it doesn't sink in through what I've already read, just look at Ephesians 6:12. Paul says, "For we are not contending against flesh and blood, but against the principalities, against the powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness, against the spiritual hosts of wickedness in the heavenly places." He lays it out there and says, look, you are fighting against evil. And that's what we're doing in ministry. So have no fear, but don't forget it. Because when we forget it, that's when we start to stumble and start to lose perspective on why everything is hard. It's hard because we're fighting. We're fighting someone who doesn't like this. Lastly, I just want to wrap up with saying, take this summer to have a sort of reset, discernment time, assess how you're feeling, talk with someone that you trust, or maybe get yourself a community of people that you can talk with that you trust. Form a plan going forward to either prevent burnout or alleviate it wherever you find yourself, and make the necessary changes that you need to make to, again, avoid or alleviate it, whatever your situation is. Your strategy for this and for all things in ministry should obviously be to work very hard, to continue to storm those gates, but to move slowly. Rome wasn't built in a day. We don't have to accomplish everything by the end of the week or the month or this year even. We're laying things brick by brick. And through it all, we've got to trust God and know that all we can do is what we can control, our own decisions, our own choices, our own temperament. So much is outside of us, and God has the rest in his hands. So I want to thank you for being here today. I hope this was helpful for you, and I wish you peace, grace, and God's blessings.